everybody. Thanks for coming to our first event as part of our Future of Mobility series. My name's Mary. I'm from Stone and Chalk here. I'm the Community Partnerships Manager. I see lots of familiar faces in the room, so welcome back. But for anyone who hasn't been here before, Stone and Chalk is here to support the startup ecosystem. Above you are 3 floors of all of our startup residents, all in emerging tech, working on some of the world's most pressing problems. So Stone and Chalk is the government's innovation partner for the precinct. So we run a whole bunch of events and activity here in this space, as well as supporting all of our founders through a range of programs and working with all of the different corporates in the space and government. So I'm going to hand over to the team here and welcome, enjoy.
Hello everyone, I'm Peter Siebels, President of the RAA, and it's my great pleasure to open this evening. But before we do kick off, of course, I would like to acknowledge that today we meet on the lands of the Kaurna people, acknowledge them as the traditional owners of the land, and pay our deep respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And of course, we're right near the soon-to-be Indigenous Museum Heritage Centre, which of course is going to be a fantastic asset for South Australia. Look, this is obviously the first of the events, Dan, tonight. Correct. And we are delighted to be involved. We, of course, are a platinum partner of InsureTech and delighted to be so because our members include all of our insurance policy holders. So insurance is clearly something dear to our heart and something that we want our members to have a great experience. So InsureTech, of course, is really important to us. We, of course, also acknowledge Stone and Chalk and are up in terms of bringing this together. RAA has been about the challenges for our members for over 100 years. Now, at that time, of course, it was about moving from a horse to a motor vehicle. But today, things have changed. But our approach to innovation and our thoughts around that, of course, have not changed. But for us, it is all about our members and our community, and we acknowledge that. So much so that a few years ago we set up a dedicated innovation team, some of which are here tonight, and I'm sure you'll actually meet them over a beverage a bit later, headed by Ben Flink, and I'm sure if Ben was here he'd actually acknowledge just how much we've evolved and changed over that period. Certainly at a board level, we're very excited about what that team does. So if you think about the projects we're working on now, there's a mobility app that we're working on with Sage Automation. They're a fantastic partner, but hopefully making our members' travel experience, whether that's public transport or motor vehicle, an even better one. Similarly, we did a lot of work with 11.2, one of our partners we're very proud to partner with, on drone technology in terms of bushfire risk and identifying where major risks were. And of course, you've all read of late our EV charging station network we're building in regional South Australia and in the metro. Really important, of course, for our regional members, but we're all very excited as we transition as an organisation around EVs, although Mark Borlase can't get me one. But it is all about collaboration. So we've realised we can't be all things to our members. So our collaboration partners, of which Sage and 11.2 are just 2 of those, are really important to us. So it's on all of us, not just the RAA, not just government, not just business, but working together to think globally about our future. And for that reason, we're going to hear from some wonderful panellists tonight. So firstly, Dr. Aurelia Helfgott of DEP, RAA's own Mark Borlase. I think him as the professor of the RAA. Probably an insult to everyone that's actually earned that title, Mark, but I think of you that way. Of course, Danielle Lunderberg, who's founder of EcoCaddy, and Georgie Wilson, who, as I said, from Sage Automation, one of our great partners. So without further ado, you'll also get the chance to discuss and collaborate together as you answer questions, which of course is what we love about these formats. So with that, I will pass to Dan Conley to lead you through the exercise, and delighted to be involved.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, welcome. You can hear me all right with the lapel microphone? Yeah, awesome. Welcome, my name's Dan. I work for Arup, who is a partner on this event series. I'm a planner in cities and mobility, and for that reason, I'm incredibly excited and privileged, I think, to be hosting this very interesting conversation between 4 panelists who I could probably listen to for an hour each. So it's also going to be a challenge keeping to 60 minutes. Thanks everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it, especially in the weather that we've got at the moment. We do have an audience joining us online as well. So welcome to the online audience. How many people do we have roughly, Mike, online at the moment? Yeah, okay. So we've got about 30 people online as well, which is awesome. Yeah, amazing turnout. It's going to be a really interesting conversation. I might just provide a little bit of context to this event series before we start. So this is the first in a series of events that we're going to be hosting at Stone and Chalk, talking about the future of mobility. The first event tonight, we're casting the net wide. We're talking about what does future mobility mean in the context of the city and the cities of the future. The second event, we're going to focus on electrification and the decarbonisation of transport. So I'm sure that's something that we're going to touch on tonight, but there will be an entire event devoted to that discussion in a bit under a month's time. And then the third event, we're going to explore operating models, business models, insurance models, ownership models, and some of those type of themes in the future of mobility as well. I'm sure we're going to touch on these points tonight, but we are going to have dedicated events for those topics. We are going to try and do it relatively interactively tonight. As you would have all joined or registered, you would have all answered a question when you registered. So do we have that up on the screen there, Mike? So we asked everyone, what does future mobility mean to you? And we got a really wide, diverse range of responses. There's things there around ownership. There's things there around technology. There's things there around cycling, which is one of the oldest mobility modes that we have. There's things around smarts, and there's things there around environment and sustainability transitions. I think it's important to note there, and I'm sure we'll explore this a little bit throughout our discussion, but I guess we're not purely technology centric when we're talking about future mobility here. So it'll be really interesting to explore that with the panelists. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our panelists and allow you each to introduce yourselves and provide some background on what it is that you do, but also perhaps explain, what does future mobility mean to you? What is future mobility? And perhaps in the short to medium term, like, what are the tangible things that we can associate with future mobility? What are the sorts of changes that we'll think we'll see? We all need to speak into the microphone. Who would like to start? Mark, go for it.
So Mark Paules, I look after future mobility policy within the RAA. We've got as Peter said, we've got 780,000 members in South Australia. We've been around for nearly 120 years. So we've had to remain relevant. We've had to transition, and we're going through a very big transition period now. We've got an ageing membership that eventually may have to give up their cars, but we know that if they lose that mobility, then a lot of other health issues come along. So we've got to find ways for them to transition to a life where they can still move, but not necessarily be anchored to a car. We've got a younger population of members coming through who are transitioning into cars, or maybe might not transition into cars. So we've got to look after them to work out how they can move around as well, and how we can remain relevant to them. And because we've got a lot of moving parts in this mobility system now, from everything from e-scooters to car sharing to, as you said, electrification, and eventually some autonomy in vehicles, we need to try and navigate our membership through them to not necessarily back winners, but try and help them find the best solution for whatever their mobility needs are, no matter where they are in their life. And the traditional stuff like families are still probably going to need 1 or 2 cars, because you're going to have to bring kids around, cart kids around. So that's the challenge for us as an organisation, to stay relevant and to make it so that we're matching our services to their needs at the time.
Hi everyone, my name's Ariella. I'm the Director of Strategic Foresight with the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and a lot of people don't actually know what that job title means at all. But basically, there are 4 types of question that I have to address about the future. One of them is what is probably going to happen. So using all of the data and mathematical models to look at likely futures. But another one is, what do we want or not want to have happen as a state? And that has nothing to do with data. That's all about helping people get in touch with their deepest values and articulate the type of future they'd actually really like to live in. And then the third question is, what could plausibly happen, whether we like it or not, and even if it's very unlikely. And that's more the exploratory scenarios that help us to pin down the edges of the board and not just be blinded by our assumptions about what we think is most likely right now, especially given that we're entering an era of really fast and fundamental changes in all of the social, economic, technological, environmental dimensions of life. And then the final question is the what are we going to do about it part. And in terms of answer to this question about what I think about the future of mobility, I ask myself questions about what are the reasons that people need to be mobile at different times in their life. And some of the basic reasons for that relate to the services that they need for their lives, like healthcare and education and accessing food, and also being able to meet with other people being able to explore the world, different things like that. And there are just such big changes happening in all of those things right now. So in terms of the health side, we're heading for much more like mass customization and personalization. And it's not unthinkable that in the not very distant future, you might do a poo and your toilet might tell you about your own microbiome and what you need to be eating. And sequencing the human genome used to cost a lot of money. Now it's like around the order of $100. By the time it's super cheap, you might be doing a lot of diagnostic work at home, and your medication could be being delivered to you by drone. The digitalization of government services and education, it's happening and it's continuing. So what will be the reasons that people want to travel or to access all of these different things? There's so much change on the horizon that the second question, the what do we want this to look like, becomes really important right now. And if I had a say in it, I would say that we should be designing this around communities. So right now, all of these, the shape of our cities and the shape of the way all of this is being done and the way that people access mobility isn't necessarily designed with communities at the center. And I imagine a more village-like structure in the future where people are accessing a lot of things at home, but also lots of common spaces locally, so that it's a different type of mobility, but then you also want to be able to visit people in other little villages, you know, all of this type of stuff. But that's just one vignette. It's so hard to talk about the future of something that depends on a situation where everything's changing.
And I think also, like, we forget sometimes that mobility is a means to an end, right? Like, we don't just travel for, Thanks, Ariella. Sorry to interrupt you, but I think you make such a good point. Like, we don't travel for travel's sake. A lot of the time we travel to get to a destination or to access something that we need for our everyday lives. Daniels, I'd be really interested to hear your perspective on this one as well.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see your model when it's all done and use that to govern how we're growing as a company. So I'm Daniels Langenberg. I'm the founder of EcoCaddy. So we're a micro-mobility company in the city that operates a fleet of bamboo body pedicabs. We essentially do a number of things, including getting people from A to B during events. We also do tours. We're an advertising service, so we do positive advertising on our vehicles, and that enables us to provide rides for free, which is really nice. So we really believe in free transportation as a way to mobilize communities. I mean, that's what makes an equitable community. So speaking about that, and we're also a logistics company. That's what we are at the core. So we have been playing around for a number of years of not just moving people, but moving things. And at the moment, we're moving food waste around. Our big thing is really around decarbonizing, making an impact and creating resilient communities. One of the ways that we do that is through accessibility. I think the prosperity of a city is tied to its mobility. I spent a lot of time in Asia. My mother's from Africa. I was born in Sweden. I've seen mobility from various lenses, and now I've started a transport company coming out of urban design. So pretty interesting in that I felt the most free when I was living in second and third world countries, where particularly in the second world countries, like parts of China, where they had fast trains and they had just a huge amount of choice when it came to mobility. And then coming back to Adelaide and seeing that we've basically got one form of transportation. So that's why I started EcoCaddy, was to add to the mix. I think mix is really important. I think mix is the future. And to your point, I think flexibility is really important. So we can't have this blanket approach anymore. We really need to contextualize and customize. So yeah, to be expansive in thinking, I think that the future of mobility is three-dimensional. We're no longer going to be on the second, that plane, that ground plane. We're going to be in the sky. We're going to be underground where it makes sense in pressurized cities like our metropolises like Shanghai and New York, where it's cheaper to go underground or cheaper to go into the skies. I think the most prosperous cities are those that have the best public transport systems. And I think public transport has a role of social inclusion and social cohesion. I think that things like trains and trams, the theatre of our cities where people can empathize with their neighbors and their strangers through observation. And I fear that if we go to the way of mass mobility, which is privatized and compartmentalized, we may further segregate and spread out our cities, which is touching on the second question. But yeah, so I think three-dimensional. I think universal is also really important. Universal in that in a couple of different lenses will be exploring the universe. So space travel and space tourism will be really cool. There's all this talk about UBI, universal basic income. What about universal basic transportation, where everyone is given basic transport, where everyone has access to all parts of the city? I think people have a different experience on a city, particularly centric cities like Adelaide. There are lots of people in this town that don't come to the city much. We know that because we ask them. I took a lady a couple of years ago that had never left Salisbury until the age of 17 or that area. She'd never jumped on a plane. So thinking through that lens, they have a different view of how a city works. And so I think that's really important, universality as well. And access, that's the last thing. Yeah, accessibility.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks. I've got a lapel
You've got
mic. Can you
lapel.
hear me okay? Georgie Johnson, I'm the National Smart Cities Sector Business Manager for Sage Automation, and it's a privilege to be here. I guess the challenge with going last is sometimes your dot points have been taken, but I guess I'll take this opportunity really to share some exciting things that Sage is doing, and at the core of that and future mobility is the mass app that we're building for RIA, and we're really excited about that. We're agnostic systems integrators, and so are taking a lot of mobility elements, building it into a really exciting application which will be released to the market. Some of the other things that we're doing and seeing in the marketplace is that need for demand, and so we have acquired the Ad Insight software, which allows us to control traffic lights. And so that vehicle to infrastructure future and organizing the SCATS infrastructure and the road loops that are existing elements of technology in our landscape, in our neighborhoods, and then being able to drive the way that's used by user demand is really the future that we see in mobility. But essentially, mobility for us is about going from point A to point B, and that may look like in a vehicle, or it may look like another mode of mobility. And so we're seeing as a trend that 18 to 24-year-olds don't want to own a private car. And so what does that mean for our other elements of social infrastructure, which the rest of my panelists have already touched on? But the ability to have access, the ability to be able to live and breathe within your local neighborhood, and to be able to move around on demand as you want to as a user, is where we see the future of mobility.
Thanks, Georgie. And thank you for providing us some great examples of how technology is playing a role in this transformation as well. So what I'd be keen to do now is get some engagement from the audience. So what we're going to do is we're going to put up a question. Now, we've touched on a few themes here, very broad. I think we're talking about the future of cities, the future of mobility. I think that there is a central shift in technology that is happening in transport. And we've been talking about energy for the last 10 years, right? As like the renewables transition, everything's changing, everything's going low carbon. It's almost as though that's now about to start playing out in mobility in the way that it has in energy, in the sense that now our vehicles are starting to electrify. We're talking about new ownership models. We're talking about these mobility as a service kind of systems that are A to B without specifying a mode. So I think there is a change that technology is enabling in cities when it comes to our transport systems. But the question that we'd like to ask through the Mentimeter, is that code there, Mike? That's the right code? The question that we'd like to ask is specifically around autonomous shared vehicles. Now, these might be 5 years away, they might be 20 years away, but this is one of the things I think that people often go back to when they think about like future transport. Are these type of technological shifts going to make our cities better? And we've got a scale of 1 to 10 here. So if you've got your mobile phones on you, we'd love you to scan the code and just gauge the room a little bit on what everyone's thoughts are around some of these technology trends. We're going to then ask our panelists to discuss this question as well. We're sitting right on, yeah, that'd be funny if we end on 5, exactly 5.0. So does anyone, and we're still waiting for everyone to provide their responses, but has anyone answered like a low number, like a 0 or like a 1 or a 2, that would like to perhaps share like a 10-second elevator pitch with the room about why they said what they said? Yep, gentleman here, thank you.
The fundamental problem with cars is that they're hideously inefficient. It doesn't matter if you automate or make them electric or whatever, cars are still the problem.
Yeah, like it's a fundamental matter of space. We can only fit so many cars on the road. And if everything's electric, we're still going to have the same constraints that we have at the moment. Yeah, great point. Thank you so much. And on the other end of the spectrum, who are the optimists in the room? Sir, would you like to, Mary, just down here on the couch, please?
Thank you. I didn't see it as cars, I saw it as vehicles. So I think buses going all the way around all the time, being able to transport people in a mass transport situation like they do in many parts of the world where it works very well, would work well in Adelaide.
Great response. Thank you very much. Panelists, I'd like to ask you all, feel free to share your view on this, but I think given that you're the experts in the room, not only will autonomous shared vehicles and just these sort of technological changes in general make our cities better, but more so, how do we ensure that they make our cities better? What are the design principles that need to govern the implementation of smart technology, smart mobility, to ensure that, as Ara has said, like we're taking a community-centered approach, we're taking a people-centered approach? Ariella, I might hand to you first, if that's all right.
Yeah, I'm glad you did, because I've felt this strong urge to respond to that. Will a technology make the world better or not? The answer is always, it depends on how it's managed. But I will tell you some of the reasons that I feel excited about the possibilities of autonomous vehicles. Statistically, on average, people use their vehicles, their cars and things, 4% of the time. So if you have an autonomous vehicle that is able to just keep moving and doesn't need to just stay parked while you're doing whatever you're doing in a particular building, we just don't need all of those car parks. They can be returned to green spaces. Also, autonomous vehicles, whereas when humans drive cars, they just tend to wander all over the road. Autonomous vehicles tend to stay within 1 to 3 millimeters of the track that they're driving on. So that trials in Minnesota ended up with rutting of asphalt within a week, which means that our current road infrastructure isn't really fit for this, and we would need to rethink what roads look like. And there are future visions where you've just got the AVs running on tracks and everything in between is permeable material that can be used for stormwater catchment and hugely increased green space. And no, you probably don't need the same number of cars on roads, even with personalised transport, if the cars are just constantly moving around. There's calculations to be made about that. And obviously it depends on the shape of the future cities and the reasons that people are being mobile and the population, all that sort of stuff. But there's a lot of positive possibilities there. Then there's also things like, just for me personally, my dad should probably not be on the road anymore. Dad, I hope you're not listening. And it would just make me feel a lot safer to know that he could go there. Or if you are a single mum and you have to drive your kid to everything, but then you knew that you could put a pin lock on an AV and have your kids safely arrive at ballet class, that there's a lot of unlocked possibilities here that if we think about how to do it in a way that is inclusive, including for mobility impaired people like my dad who can't get into every single type of vehicle, you could literally really increase the mobility and the access to mobility of so many people. And it can be where personal transport meets public transport.
Yeah, I'd love to expand on that in that I'm a bit of a fence sitter on it. I think it really does depend on the type of vehicle. I believe that this sort of technology which is driverless technology, we're talking about autonomy, but I think if we emphasize the driverless part, it's really exciting in terms of what we unlock with productivity. So right now people have to drive and they can't do anything else. What happens when people don't have to drive and concentrate on the road? That unlocks all sorts of activities which can happen. And really the focus there and what my company is betting on is experience. So what is the experience that people are having when they're on these vehicles? What is that vehicle doing? Where are people coming from? Where are they going to? It unlocks so many possibilities around obviously ownership, but also like around home ownership. With the skyrocketing prices of houses where you can live anywhere in the world and you can get onto an autonomous vehicle and it drives when you sleep and you arrive at your destination when you wake up. Why do you even need a house anymore? There could be a whole nomadic population that literally just goes between Adelaide and Melbourne, and they work on these. It's already happening on the West Coast in America, where they have driverless buses going between San Diego and San Francisco and LA. So there are whole different ways that we're not even seeing yet, and we're getting little snippets of. But yeah, I think it's really important in terms of the form factor which we actually choose. The thing about The car is, we've seen with Uber, the traffic's gone up 30% in San Francisco since rideshare's come along. So if we have more people choosing to be in single vehicles, it doesn't solve that problem. You need to aggregate that demand. You need to carpool. So yeah, really the size of the vehicle, and still mass mobility, buses or shuttles still makes sense in that regard. But I think it's dependent on speed. It's dependent on, the environment. I think planning, we need to talk about planning, urban planning here, being a part of being integrated with transport orientated development. Those things are really critical to making it all work.
Awesome. Thanks. Georgie, we'll go to you. Your company's obviously leading the way globally now in this sort of smart mobility transformation. Be really interested to hear your perspective on this. Actually, Dan, would you mind handing the mic to George? Oh, no, she's got the lapel. Sorry. Yeah, you're right.
Sure. So Sage Automation have been part of about 7 autonomous vehicle trials in Australia to date, and we're in the process of deploying our smart transit hub, which we affectionately call Matilda, through to New South Wales for another trial. And for us, that really is about that vehicle to infrastructure connection. And so the autonomous vehicle having a destination that's providing equity and access for broader services. So whether that be a screen where they can find out broader information that connects them to the public transport that's in the area, being able to charge your phone while you sit and wait at a bus stop. Will autonomous vehicles make our cities better is the actual question. That's hard to answer. As you said, with technology, it's a quid pro quo in some instances. I guess it really comes down for me to your intrinsic values and what do you put the value on? Is it that ability to control your circumstances and be able to drive anywhere at any time, wherever you want to go? Or is it that you want to be able to have productivity even when you're in a transportation scenario and you want to be able to sit there and do your work emails or finish your report or read a book and be able to continue your life while you're transiting between A to B? And to me, to touch on a future question, the real blocker around this is legislation and regulation. And so unless we unlock that, will AVs change our cities? Currently, no, because we can't even get them on the roads. If we can get them on the roads, then they might be able to change our cities.
Yeah. The autonomous vehicle question is, I think, a question of 4 parts. One is that it relies on some other technology. So it relies on connectivity. We need 5G, so there's no latency, so that cars can talk to cars, cars can talk to traffic lights, cars can talk to other vulnerable users. Then everybody knows in the smart system where they are. Once you've got that, to answer the young man's issue about the cars, then you can actually think about the car doesn't have to be the car that we know now. They can be actually module sized. If they're not going to hit something, you can actually make them smaller, more efficient, and have precincts where they work. So the first thing is the communication. The second is how you redefine the vehicle. The third is, it is legislation, but it's really insurance. Currently, insurances for vehicles is designed to cover people who are human, who make poor decisions. Once you start trying to insure a machine, you're actually insuring software that says, our software is good enough, I'm not going to hit somebody. And when it does, you go, well, that's actually a product liability problem. So there's a whole schism between the insurance industry about how they're going to do this. And the last is, it won't be ubiquitous. It won't happen everywhere. It'll happen in places. So an example might be, if you're having a new development, a property development, you may say to the people who are going to buy properties there, who may be affluent enough to pay for it, you won't be able to live here unless you have a smart car. We're not going to have dumb cars in this region because we don't know how to manage them. So the trade-off is, they'll say, well, why do I have to buy a car like that? One of the trade-offs is, as long as it's in this precinct, you can send the kids to school in the car in the morning by themselves, or you can get out of the shopping centre when it's raining and tell the car to go and find a park. Or you can, so the trade-off is, you develop these systems. Now, there'll be corridors between them to the other smart suburbs, but it's not going to be ubiquitous. And it's autonomous technology that allow an autonomous four-wheel drive to drive through the Simpson is probably never going to happen. So let's just understand that autonomous technology will substantially be an urban and suburban technology. Yeah, it's not just about the car, it's not just about the roads, it's about getting all of those things lined up.
Great. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, everyone. Mike, we've got another question for the audience. All right. Next question. Does a smart mobility system equal a more equitable mobility system? So we're touching on the social dimension of mobility here. Please scan your Menti code and give us a yes or no answer. I really like Mark's point here about this whole vision of a utopian city that's running off heaps of autonomous vehicles is realistically a very long way away. It is an interesting point you make, Mark, about this happening in specific locations. Are there social trade-offs to that? What are the important, and I think I'm really interested for this next question as well to hone back to that so what point. So what do we actually have to do? Because I think like the last question we asked, will it lead to a better city? The answer is it depends on how you implement it. That's exactly right. I'm sure we've got some practitioners in the room who are working in this space. What are the types of considerations that we need to make along the way to ensure that the social equality is embedded in the outcomes we achieve? Would anyone like to volunteer to give a perspective on the yes side of the room? No one wants to share their thoughts on the yes? Does anyone want to share their thoughts on the no? Going once, going twice? Yeah. Thank you, Mary.
My opinion is that maybe the people with a vehicle drive by themselves, the cost of driving the vehicle by themselves will be much higher when we have the shared vehicle in the future.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Great point.
One more.
Yeah, sure.
Probably similar, but there'll always be a cheaper option.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a really good counterpoint. I think that's just giving us a sense of the room and the feel in the room. It's really interesting, right? We've got like probably 50 people in the room that have come along to an event on a cold, rainy night to talk about future mobility. It's obviously it's a subject that people are interested in, and probably 80% of us or something think that it's not going to be an equitable system. So I guess, yeah, panelists, what do we take from this? And of course, Georgie, you're up first for this one. Take it away. Thank you.
I'd love to go first, and I'd love to tell you a story. And it's a project that we're currently working on, which is really dear to my heart. We have a programmer in our team called Cassie Holmes, and she's legally blind. And she's been working on this global award that she's applied for called the Holman Prize. And it's to solve an equity issue around her ability to have mobility to catch public transport to come to work. So Cassie, as a legally blind human, she stands at a public bus stop with high vis on, with her walking cane, with the bus labeled on a laminated sheet, hoping that the bus driver is going to stop and that her route is going to pick her up. If she can get on the vehicle, and sometimes that doesn't happen, then she has to inform the driver to stop for her as the stop that she wants to get off. That may or may not happen because that's not the primary focus of the bus driver. His primary focus is not to crash. It's to get his route achieved rather than just care for the one human being that might have stepped on that requires that additional service. And so sometimes Cassie can end up at the end of the line rather than at a bus stop. And there's nothing she can do about that other than catch a return bus and hope that the next bus driver will help her. And so part of what we've applied for the Holman Prize Award for is to create an app so that as legally blind people, they're able to pre-book a bus driver to stop at their stop, and they're also able to notify them that at the stop that they want to get off, and it's voice activated or their ability to do that. And we're talking about it from a legally blind perspective, but it also helps with non-English speaking background people and people that just want to sit on the bus and read their book rather than focus on their bus stop. And so that would unlock equity for public transport people that want to move in that mode, the ability to be able to do that. And I personally drive my car to work. I've never thought about that scenario until I met Cassie and now have a relationship with Cassie and see her day-to-day struggles. And so I think when we think about smart mobility, we might just think about Teslas, and not all of us can afford that. And so the equity around that, or that's not possible. And so I understand why you answered no. But when I think about smart mobility and what that could unlock for Cassie and people that have the same challenges in life that she does, that makes me really excited. And it's a problem I know we will solve whether we get the funding or not, because it's so important to use technology to actually advance equitable services in our public realm.
Yeah, look, with all technologies, there's always those who benefit from it early, and they're normally the ones who can afford to pay it. So there's always going to be a social disconnect at the beginning. If you look at what most smart cities and mobility systems are looking at, they're still using public transport as the spine onto which all these smart things bolt onto. Sometimes, like, the smartest car might be the one that tells you in the morning, don't use me. I've looked at the traffic and you're better off catching a bus. So that's the sort of smartness that you want, and you really need an integrated, robust, frequent, safe public transport system for all of these other things to interact. And hopefully, when you get those sorts of importance placed on it, the scale that it brings will give efficiencies that allow these sorts of systems and even simpler things. A lot of blind people, when they get on, they don't know which seats are vacant.
Yeah.
You've got to feel your way, which is not a good way to find out where a seat is. Whereas systems that say this bus is pulling up and the third seat on the right is free, you've got a bit of dignity given back as well. Because so there's a lot of this stuff, but the public transport system is where we've got to put our focus on, because rich people will be able to afford smart cars and get away with it, but we really need to make it so that the smartness is focused on the public transport part of the equation that people in cars will actually want to come to.
I very much feel the same way as everything that you just described, particularly thinking about it from a government perspective. And I'm literally focused on the opportunities for smart mobility and autonomous vehicles to help increase equitable outcomes functionally for people that are mobility impaired in any way, but also through the thing that you're going to talk about in the third session when it comes to ownership models as well. I feel like this entire transformation does raise questions about how fast we may be heading towards the end of private car ownership and towards these sort of shared fleets, and who should own them. Are we talking government fleets? Are we talking cooperatives and associations like the RAA, which have a mandate to act in the public benefit, or more worrying things that might not result in more equity, like some very rich people owning all of the expensive stuff that everybody depends upon? So there's all this opportunity for greater equity, and there's also risks associated with this transition that Mark flagged when he talked about who are the people who are first going to be able to afford this. And that's why, as governments, we're trying to think about this and think about how to make sure we're trying to aim to head for a smart, green and inclusive society, not something that is less of those things.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think I'd like to be optimistic in thinking that it's going to be great for society, particularly from a participation point of view. Getting members of society that can't participate now because they have a disability, or even gender comes into it. Traveling at night, women are our most frequent riders, and they would rather pay to have company take them across a dark street or a dark city rather than walking by themselves. So I think that safety aspect is so important, that participation. And really it will lie on the business models and how much we let them run free around, who gets to own them and how we hold them accountable. So I think I'd like to think that we can do better than the last generation, in that the service will be better. The service model will be better because hopefully we're getting better unit economics. And really, it's a race to the bottom in the business world when it comes to transport. Making money off of actual fares, I think, will probably be a thing of the past, because it's like, how can you charge for something that doesn't really cost much to run? If you're running it on clean energy, if you're running it on green materials, which you have less vehicle because they're safer, so you don't need all the collision safety aspects. So I think, the business models will be really interesting, but it comes down to ownership. And certainly with Tesla, the people that can afford those vehicles right now are those that are more affluent, and they will be the ones that will be able to co-share those vehicles to start off with. So it'll be interesting to see how the market responds.
Okay, we've got time for a little bit of question. Does anyone want to ask a question of our panel? Absolutely. Young lady at the front.
Thanks, Dan. I just have a question around active transport, future mobility. We haven't touched at all upon walking and cycling, so interested in all your opinions on that.
I'm obviously a huge advocate for active transportation.
Great
given
question.
That people cycle that around. I thought I'd add that a little bit later, but I think health is really important, and health is something that will guide everything that we do. You can see how Apple and these big companies are just becoming health companies. If you don't have healthy customers, they won't be your customers for long because, to be groomed, they'll be dead. So you want to keep them alive as long as possible. And I think active transportation is so important. Why not do two things at once? Why not commute and get healthy at the same time? The other thing that's beautiful about active transportation is it connects you to the city or to the place. I'm fearful of how much glass and metal we're wrapped in right now because we have to stay safe because we're running over engineered vehicles just in case we go 200 kilometers an hour and we crash into something. The beauty about a bike is that you're completely exposed. All your senses are firing away. You're traveling at a speed where you actually notice things and you're not just trying to keep yourself alive, depending on what road you go down on a bicycle. The beautiful thing about an EcoCaddy is that we're the size of a vehicle and we have a very commanding position. So we're at the SUV height as a rider. But I think that's really important is connectivity, connection to the city. It's really important from a business perspective as well. Things like trams are really great for business because you have predictability around traffic. You know that there's going to be a certain amount of people coming to the front. You don't get that with cars. You might not get that with autonomous vehicles. So I think, active transport is important. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Do you want to jump in somewhat? Yep.
Two quick ones. First of all, parochially, Adelaide is perfect for bike riding. RA is about to do their risky rides survey. So we're asking cyclists where are the dangerous bits so we can start to lobby government to get that fixed. The second part is the infrastructure. There's been proposals to do the continuous bike loop around the city, which we think is obviously good for a commute, but also good for tourism. And ironically, my understanding is the City of London now, they've got e-scooters and they've got stuff that well. They're actually trying to put back in 400 metres of walking into people's days. So they actually start to, walk again. Sorry.
2 years ago, I moved back to Australia from the Netherlands. I'm completely enculturated into cycling absolutely everywhere, and I am a cyclist. The reason why I'm not mentioning it earlier is we're having a conversation about inclusivity, then obviously active transport only works for people who are capable of getting on a bike if you're impaired in a way that you can't. So that's the only reason for not mentioning it. But in this whole conversation earlier about rethinking the shape of cities, what's on my mind is basically we're heading for increasingly more days above 42 degrees in a year. We need to do a lot of urban greening to manage the urban heat island effect, rethinking what transport corridors look like and ensuring you're maximising bicycle and foot transport and as much as possible and minimising the number of vehicles that need to be on the road while still maximising inclusive mobility is part of that whole picture. So I'm very excited about unlocking more land for more bike lanes with all these disruptions.
Yes, so the term in the industry is green waving. So you want to see that prioritisation of active transport being green waved through an intersection, and we're able to do that with technology, with IoT, Internet of Things devices out in the public realm to prioritise that the tram has arrived at that stop and we're anticipating that 100 people now need to move through this intersection to get to their next destination. It also looks like that infrastructure and green canopy to make it an enjoyable experience to move around your neighbourhood or the route that you want to take to do the active transport. And I think walking and cycling is an essential part of our future. I think as a generation, we embrace it. And while there will always be pockets of society that can't do that mode of transport, just like we've talked about pockets of society that won't be able to afford a smart car, there's physical elements that we need to do. And at the moment, essentially, we're prioritising vehicles still.
I think we've said this point over and over, haven't we, really? But it can go either way. It's let's use these new technologies as an enabler for the walking and the cycling, because that's the future that we collectively choose. We do have a few questions coming through online. Francesco asks, how would insurance work with autonomous vehicles? Francesco, we do have an event committed to that in a month or two, so we might save that one for then. But if anyone else has any questions, please throw them in the chat. Does anyone in the audience here want to ask a question? Yeah, there's a lady on the couch there.
Thank you. I found that really interesting, very engaging conversations. Just a few points I made. I think I largely agree the system that we currently have needs to be completely overhauled. But I feel like it's going to take significant funding from the government to transform our roads, to build safer cycle paths. On that note, my partner and I used to live in China, in Shanghai, and we lived on our bikes. It was fantastic. You could find these bikes for like 10 cents an hour and you could cycle everywhere. We'd cycle like 10, 20 Ks every day. But here in Adelaide, wouldn't dream of doing it. Like from Burnside to here, like the cycle paths are not safe. So I just feel it will take so much funding to actually build these and then also incorporate autonomous vehicles like we were talking about earlier. But I feel like the underlying issue here, like the elephant in the room, is that people are intrinsically just a bit selfish. If we face it, we know that cycling is good for us. We know walking a few hundred extra meters per day, even where we park our cars, we're like, no, I need the closest spot to the door. How do we motivate people to intrinsically change and say, hey, it's for the collective good, not just a financial reward or environmental incentive that we all know about, but how do you guys see tackling the individual?
Yeah.
Great question.
One of the great things about Adelaide is it's very well designed. One of the bad things about Adelaide is it's really well designed. If you get Goodwood roadblocks, you've got alternate roads to get around. Getting people out of their cars is because cars in Adelaide have been so convenient for so long. Other cities use bikes almost by default because the other systems are too hard. So we do have to make it so that the cycling infrastructure is more convenient or as convenient as what the car infrastructure is right now. So you're right, it's a long game.
Without any sort of official hat on, just as myself as a cyclist, I definitely hear you. I live at Merino and I ride my bike to work in Victoria Square, and I go to and from. It's an electric bike, it's more than 20 Ks. Go along the Merino Rocks Greenway, which is pretty good, except for this section on East Terrace in Forestville, where it's terrifying. And there are a few sort of bits crossing South Road and that sort of thing. And I have a 3-year-old and I don't really feel like I can afford to die anymore. So these sorts of risks about things they're definitely a deterrent. And the reason why I'm still riding my bike is because I just got so used to it in the Netherlands. And I don't believe that people are inherently selfish. I actually think there's just a lot of cultural factors around this. Like me, I ride a sit-up bike to work in my work clothes, even though I'm going 20 kilometers. And if it rains or my hair's messed up, in the Netherlands, nobody would think that was unprofessional for me to arrive in that state. There's just like a bunch of perceptions about totally normalizing culturally riding and everything that entails, and setting up the infrastructure to make it completely safe so that you don't have to risk your life. If I was in charge of this, which I am not, I would totally ban people parking in bike lanes and fine them a lot, because it's just horrible having to swerve out into the middle of the road in front of cars. So I feel like there's a lot we can do, and I don't think it's about people being selfish. I think it's just not necessarily a viable choice for a lot of people, depending on where they live, life riskiness, the culture of their workplace, where they can park their bike, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I would say that it's really connected to infrastructure. And like I said, that prioritization of the vehicular movement right at the moment. And one of the ways that we could look at solving it as an intermediary, because you're absolutely right, massive investment. If we were to see concentrated walking, cycling, shared use paths around the city, so there was connection. A way that we could solve that while we work that out, and is that our priority, we've actually proposed to the Transport for New South Wales in an innovation challenge that they're doing, and it's looking at an adaptive solution. In a CBD, that we have designated loading zones, for example, that really only need to be activated as a loading zone for a minute part of the day, or you could make them loading zones for twice a day and then use them as something else. And so that ability to have adaptive infrastructure, I think, is a really easy way that we could be looking at prioritizing different modes of transport, whether that be Uber locations or taxi ranks or loading zones or designated cycling pathways for peak times. Like, why does it need to be a loading zone or a bus lane? It could be a cycle lane during that peak commuter time. And so it's that choice of how we use our infrastructure while we fix our infrastructure.
I didn't know if there was enough time for me to talk, but could obviously talk for days about cycling. But yeah, in terms of where to focus, it's a good question. Obviously, there's a tipping point to where people feel that they don't have to think about where they can ride safely. It's around educating and awareness of where those best routes are, and technology is enabling that with Strava, heat maps, and Cycle Instead is a great South Australian little app which you can go onto, and that gives you all of the best cycling lanes. It's pretty up to date, and obviously Google Maps as well. They're all good things. But yeah, around that discovery, I think that's what makes people feel safer. And really, you need to have a few good experiences. There's so many barriers for someone to actually pick up a bike in Adelaide, let alone ride it. And I've run a cycling group on a weekly basis for the last 6 years. And people just drop off and then they'll come back and you're like, mate, where have you been? So I got a puncture. And that's what it takes. It's just a puncture and people won't ride for a year. It's about that. There's a whole piece to it. Where do I get a tire fixed and all that sort of stuff? We need the same infrastructure for bikes and walking. That is the support system that we have for cars. We have servos on every corner. We need bike repairs on every corner. This is the sort of stuff. It's not just the cycle lane infrastructure, it's the support infrastructure as well. So it's really important.
One quick plug for the RA. We do road service for bikes. So if you do get punctures, we come out and fix it up. And if we can't fix it, we'll get a cab ride for you, and I think up to 4 people in your family. So there you go.
Panelists, this has been such a great, interesting, I work in this space every day, and this has been a really interesting, engaging discussion for me personally, and I'm sure for many members in our audience. I think it was great. We took the conversation broader than just technology. I think where we landed was that technology is going to happen, and it's undoubtedly going to be such a crucial enabler for a lot of good things. But if we don't do it right, potentially some unintended consequences as well. So it's how we implement it that matters. What you said, Dan's, about, I hope you don't mind that I call you Dan's, by the way. Dan said we need to do good. We need to make these systems better. And I think that's so true. And I think in the spirit of some of the questions that we've explored tonight, like given that they can go either way, it's so important to have these conversations and have events like we're having tonight. I would like to thank all the event partners tonight for bringing this together. Stone and Chalk, RAA, InsurTech, and Arup. We do have a bar at the back of the room. There's another hour if you'd like to hang around for another hour to do networking. While you're doing that, there's one more thing I'd like to ask. There are 3 cards that you'll probably get handed as you're walking around the room. They've got 3 questions on them. The first one is, how can we accelerate the future mobility transition? What will be the challenges for future mobility? And who needs to be involved in the future mobility transition? There's boards around the room for the responses to these questions. So if you're inclined, and it would be awesome while you're networking, whoever you're speaking to, and of course, be speaking to someone that you haven't met before, run and jot a word or 2 down on each of those boards so we can extract some really valuable insights out of the smart group of people that we've got here. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming, and please give the panelists and the partners a round of applause.